So, have you ever had one of those moments where, I don't know, maybe you're lying on your back looking up at a totally clear night sky?
Oh, yeah, just completely stargazing.
Right, exactly. Or maybe you're just incredibly deeply relaxed and you suddenly feel this overwhelming, almost magnetic urge to just evaporate.
Like completely dissolve.
Yeah, to dissolve into the cosmos, lose your boundaries, and just be an absolute nobody for a second. It's peaceful for a split second, and
And then
then
the panic sets in.
exactly. A profound terror kicks in. The instinct to pull back, to remember your name, your job, your everyday problems. It's almost violent.
Because we spend so much of our waking lives trying to build an identity.
Yes, trying to be a somebody. So the sudden prospect of completely letting go feels less like freedom and more like a massive threat.
And that tension, that exact tension between holding on to the architecture of who we are and the terrifying allure of absolute dissolution, that is the central focus of what we are unpacking today.
Yeah, today's deep dive is fascinating,
We're looking at a 1986 discourse by the Indian mystic Osho. The transcript is titled, Dancingly Disappear.
which is such a great title, by the way.
It really is. And the text fundamentally challenges the way we construct our lives.
Yeah.
It basically argues that the invisible barriers keeping us from total freedom are almost entirely self-inflicted.
Right, built by our own desperate need to maintain an ego. And the discourse actually starts with a follower asking about that exact feeling of wanting to evaporate.
Yeah, this person describes being in a state of deep relaxation and suddenly feeling a profound urge to die and just disappear into the cosmos.
And it feels beautiful to them, but they totally mistrust it. Their immediate psychological reaction is to frame it as a suicidal urge, like some secret self-hatred.
Right, but the text uses this fear to map out two entirely different ways of existing. It separates human experience into the horizontal life and the vertical life.
Okay, let's unpack this horizontal life first.
Sure, so true suicide, like the destructive kind we usually think of, the text says that is a byproduct of the horizontal life. Think of the horizontal life as a line moving straight across a flat plane.
So it's entirely quantitative.
Exactly. It is defined by the relentless accumulation of more. More money, more experiences, more prestige, more relationships, all of it.
But the fatal flaw in that geometry, right, is that the person is finite, but the plane is infinite. You only have a finite amount of time and energy.
Right, you can't conquer infinity.
No. So if your entire operating system is based on quantitative expansion, you are essentially chasing a mirage. The text describes it like walking toward the horizon.
That's a great analogy.
The horizon looks like a tangible destination, right, where the earth meets the sky. But for every single step you take forward, the horizon moves one step back.
So the distance between you and your ultimate satisfaction never actually closes.
Right. And that structural impossibility eventually breeds a really specific kind of psychological exhaustion.
Because a person living horizontally, they aren't actually against life. They are desperately trying to grab life in its absolute totality, to finally reach that horizon.
But when decades pass and they realize the distance hasn't changed at all, the pendulum of their mind swings from intense desire to intense frustration.
And that is where the urge to destroy themselves arises, according to the text. Because the horizontal life promises ultimate fulfillment, but is mathematically incapable of delivering it.
But wait, so the urge this follower is feeling during deep relaxation, that is something completely different.
They're entirely different. It's not born out of the frustration of an empty bank account or a failed career. It's happening when everything is quiet.
So this is the vertical life.
Exactly. That's the entry point. When the mind is utterly relaxed, when there is no tension, no projecting into the future, no lingering in the past, you basically step off the horizontal plane entirely.
You're not asking for anything anymore.
Right. You have no goals in that specific moment.
Yeah.
And because you aren't chasing a mirage, you are suddenly standing face to face with existence itself.
Wow.
So the desire to disappear in that state isn't an escape from misery. It's the dissolution of the ego into something infinite. It's a state of completion, not a state of giving up.
But the problem is our defense mechanisms, isn't it? Because the moment we get close to that vertical drop where we're about to merge with something larger and lose our individual boundaries, the mind sounds an absolute red alert.
Oh, total panic.
It slaps the label of suicide on the experience just to scare us into pulling back. It literally drags us back into our anxieties and our daily dramas.
Because those dramas give us an identity. We prefer the familiar misery of the horizontal life. Because, at least in that misery, we know exactly who we are.
Yeah, and to illustrate how deeply ingrained this fear of finding ultimate peace really is, The text relies on this fascinating summary of a poem by Rabindranath Tagore.
Oh, this poem is incredible. It completely dissects the psychology of the spiritual seeker.
It really does. So in the narrative, there's this poet who has been searching the universe for God for millions of lifetimes.
Literally millions of lives.
Yeah, and he builds his entire identity around this epic, eternal quest. He catches glimpses of God near distant stars, but by the time he travels there, God has always moved on.
So the search itself becomes his entire reason for existing.
Right. Then the inevitable happens. One day, the poet walks up to a house, and carved right into the door are the words, God's home.
The epic journey is finally over.
Exactly. He's standing on the marble steps. He raises his hand to knock on the door, and in that split second, he just freezes.
Because he realizes something terrifying.
He realizes that if God opens the door, the search is finished. And if the search is finished, the seeker is finished. His identity as the heroic, tragic wanderer is going to be instantly annihilated.
And the psychological pivot in the poem right here is profound. The poet slowly takes off his shoes so he won't make a single sound on the marble steps.
Just sneaking away.
Yeah, he sneaks back down and runs away in absolute terror.
Yeah.
The poem ends with him admitting that he is still out in the universe searching for God, but now he intentionally searches everywhere except that one house.
Because he knows exactly where ultimate peace lives, and he actively avoids it so his ego can survive.
It's a staggering look at human nature. We would literally rather run on the horizontal treadmill of searching for peace than actually experience it.
Because taking that final vertical step requires the ego to die, and we are just terrified of that death.
And this desperate need to keep the ego alive explains so much about our daily habits, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. If we are that terrified of the vertical drop, we'll naturally look for ways to soothe ourselves without actually having to let go. We want the feeling of peace, but we want to keep our identity while we feel it.
Which perfectly transitions into the next section of the discourse. Another follower describes a very specific phenomenon. They say when they close their eyes to meditate, they often hear the sound of a tiny bell ringing inside their head.
And they assume they are achieving some profound meditative state, right?
Right. But the text dismantles this assumption entirely. It categorizes the ringing bell not as meditation, but as deep-seated psychological conditioning.
The source actually suggests this conditioning could literally be carried over from a past life. Like perhaps as a Tibetan monk where tiny bells are constantly used in rituals.
Yeah, and regardless of how you view the concept of past lives, the underlying mechanical explanation of how the brain processes this is super fascinating.
It is. The text is outlining how the brain can be trained to produce its own internal pacifiers.
Because the neural mechanism here is essentially self-hypnosis. If a person spends countless hours in absolute silence focusing on the sound of a tiny bell, it creates a dominant neural pathway.
Right, because the mind is a machine that craves input. When external input is removed, a conditioned mind will simply project the familiar input internally.
It cannot do two things at once. If all its processing power is focused on listening to this internal bell, all other thoughts, anxieties, and horizontal desires just temporarily shut down.
It functions exactly like a mental screensaver.
Oh, that's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah, like when a computer is left idle, instead of letting the underlying code run wild, a simple repetitive logo just bounces around the screen. It keeps the monitor occupied with a low-energy task so nothing else pops up.
So the ringing bell is just keeping the brain occupied. It feels peaceful, but it's a manufactured peace.
And the text is really meticulous in separating this manufactured peace from actual spiritual liberation. It brings in historical examples to demonstrate how this screensaver mechanism works.
Like Lord Tennyson.
Yes, the famous poet. The text uses him as a prime example of spontaneous self-hypnosis.
Because as a child, he was terrified of the dark. So he discovered that if he repeated his own name out loud,
Just saying Tennyson, Tennyson, Tennyson,
over and over, he would enter a deeply serene, immaterial state.
he weaponized semantic satiation. By repeating a single word until it lost all meaning, he blocked out his fear of ghosts in the dark and eventually fell into a profound sleep.
And the text argues that every mantra, every repetitive chant, every internal ringing bell functions on this exact same hypnotic principle. You narrow the mind's focus down to a single point until the mind simply exhausts itself.
It relies heavily on the deliberate use of boredom, doesn't it?
It really does. The text references a journalist who observed Osho speaking. The journalist noted that the incredibly slow cadence, the long, unpredictable gaps between words, it actually induced a feeling of intense boredom.
But because the listener was forced to sit with that boredom, to just endure the gaps without external stimulation, the boredom eventually morphed into a deep serenity.
Exactly. The mind simply gave up trying to be entertained and dropped into a self-induced hypnotic state.
Now, the source does acknowledge that this kind of hypnosis is actually quite healthy. It provides a deeper rest than ordinary sleep. It rejuvenates the nervous system.
But the temptation is to view this state of extreme relaxation as the ultimate goal. And the text draws a massive, impenetrable line right here.
Right. It insists this is a function of the mind and the body. It is a biological trick. It is absolutely not meditation.
So the distinction lies in the direction of awareness. Hypnosis, chanting, or listening to an internal bell, those are processes of receding consciousness.
Meaning, as the chant continues or as the sound of the bell gets thinner and more distant, the person's awareness fades along with it.
Leading eventually to unconsciousness or sleep. True meditation, as defined in this discourse, requires a third element beyond the mind and body. It requires the presence of the being.
So the mechanics of true meditation require a paradoxical effort. If you are using a fading sound, like a bell, you don't let it lull you to sleep.
Right, you have to stay awake.
As the sound gets quieter, your alertness has to proportionally increase to track it. And the ultimate test arrives at the exact millisecond the sound vanishes completely.
Because in hypnosis, you'd be asleep by then.
But in meditation, when the input hits absolute zero, you are left in a state of utter silence, but your consciousness is blazing.
It's the unification of absolute silence and total intense consciousness. The mind is entirely still, yet the individual is entirely awake.
Which requires a formidable amount of presence just to exist in that void without instantly manufacturing a thought or a sound to fill it.
It really does.
But if true meditation requires this immense strength of presence, and yet we are so easily lulled into hypnotic screensavers or terrified into running back to our horizontal treadmills.
It begs the question of how we became so spiritually fragile in the first place.
Exactly. Where does this inherent weakness, this inability to just exist in the vertical moment actually come from?
Well, the text addresses this root cause through the final question it analyzes. A follower shares a drawing they made of themselves as a flower.
Right, the blossom is beautiful, it's emitting a faint light, the leaves are vibrant.
But beneath the surface, the roots are incredibly weak, shallow, and underdeveloped.
The follower senses this catastrophic mismatch between their external presentation and their internal foundation.
And the text responds by elevating this personal drawing to a universal diagnosis, stating that this is the condition of almost every human being on the planet.
The metaphor used to explain this systemic weakness is both brilliant and chilling. The text compares the average human life to the Japanese art of the bonsai tree.
Yeah. You can find bonsai trees that are 400 or 500 years old. They boast the gnarled bark and complex branch structures of ancient oaks, yet they are only 6 inches tall.
They look like complete trees, but they have never been allowed to realize their actual genetic potential.
Because the methodology behind creating a bonsai tree is deeply symbolic here. Generations of gardeners plant the tree in a shallow mud pot with no bottom.
No bottom.
Right, so whenever the tree attempts to grow naturally, whenever its roots reach through the bottom of the pot searching for the deep earth, the gardener systematically cuts them off.
Wow. So the visible part of the tree is carefully maintained, but its foundational connection to the earth is perpetually severed.
The tree survives, it grows old, but it never truly blossoms in the way nature intended.
And the discourse explicitly applies this exact mechanism to human society. It basically argues that institutions, cultures, and families systematically cut the roots of individuals from the moment they're born.
And the primary shears used for this pruning is the demand for absolute obedience.
The text takes a pretty radical philosophical stance on the concept of compliance here.
It really does.
Yeah.
It argues that demanding unquestioning obedience from a child, forcing them to prioritize the authority of parents, teachers, or religious figures over their own emerging intelligence, that systematically destroys their individuality.
Because when a person is never permitted to think critically, to evaluate a situation on their own, or to take responsibility for their own choices, their internal foundation fails to develop.
But the immediate counterargument that arises here is practicality, right?
Right, like society requires a certain level of obedience to function. If children don't learn rules, or if citizens ignore laws, communities collapse into chaos.
True, but the text isn't necessarily arguing for chaos. It's dissecting the psychological cost of forced civility. If the environment makes it impossible for a person to safely say no, then forcing them to say yes creates a completely hollow compliance.
The philosophical weight rests on the authenticity of choice. A meaningless yes, extracted through fear or guilt or the threat of ostracization, it turns a human being into an automaton.
They are surviving, they are functioning within the system, but their actions are not their own.
They grow old, exactly like the bonsai tree, but they never grow up into highly individualized, autonomous beings. Their roots are just too shallow to support genuine freedom.
And to ground this philosophy in reality, the discourse relays a deeply personal narrative of defiant noncompliance. First, Osho recounts a moment from his childhood within a large traditional family where the quiet, obedient children were naturally the most respected.
Right. But recognizing the psychological trap, he explicitly goes to his father and renounces all claim to respectability.
Which is a bold move for a kid. He draws a hard boundary, declaring that he will rely solely on his own intelligence.
He clarifies that if a request is logical and beneficial, he will comply. But the compliance will be an act of his own free will, not an act of blind submission to parental authority.
He demands the space to develop his own roots, even at the cost of social approval.
And then the text scales this childhood defiance up to a massive geopolitical confrontation, detailing his much later arrest in Crete, Greece.
The narrative describes an overwhelming, aggressive police raid.
Yeah, the authorities didn't just knock. The text details them breaking in, throwing his secretary, Anando, onto the gravel, and threatening to dynamite the residence.
And in the aftermath of all this chaos, the police demanded he sign a report detailing the arrest.
But the critical moment is his absolute refusal to sign the document. He recognized that the report was falsified, omitting all the violence and the threats designed to legally sanitize the authorities' actions.
By refusing to sign, he was intentionally blocking the machinery of a corrupt process.
And the resistance escalated at every single step. When they attempted to deport him by boat, he refused to board, demanding a written document from the authorities taking legal responsibility if the journey made him seasick.
He literally forced the bureaucracy to halt, eventually demanding his own jet plane, and openly admonished the police for behaving in a primitive, inhuman manner.
Now, while the narrative of the Crete incident is very dramatic, its inclusion in the text serves a highly specific philosophical purpose. It is essentially a real-time stress test of the bonsai tree metaphor.
Exactly. Confronted with the overwhelming coercive power of a state authority demanding immediate obedience, he refuses to act like a pruned tree.
He forces the authorities to interact with him as an unbending individual. There's even a part where a police officer notes that no one ever taught him obedience, and he agrees, framing that lack of conditioning as his greatest strength.
And he clarifies that he isn't arbitrarily against the concept of agreement. He simply demands the absolute right to pilot his own life, based on his own consciousness, without the heavy hand of institutional interference.
Because if you sign a falsified document just to make the scary situation go away, you are cutting your own roots. You are preserving your physical safety at the expense of your internal being.
The broader societal diagnosis presented here is pretty devastating. The text argues that the demand for servility has been institutionalized for generations.
It even critiques theological frameworks, like the doctrine of original sin, arguing that narratives which punish the pursuit of knowledge and disobedience are specifically designed to keep human potential locked in a shallow pot.
Because the text asserts that every single person walking the earth possesses the latent potential to be a Socrates, a Pythagoras, or a Buddha.
The architecture of a genius exists within everyone. But that potential is starved because our roots are constantly severed by a society that demands we just nod along, follow the blueprint, and prioritize blending in over breaking out.
We are denied the psychological nourishment required to fight for our own unique shape.
So the ultimate tragedy, according to the discourse, is this vast, untapped human potential. To repair the weak roots depicted in the follower's drawing, the methodology of society must be inverted.
Instead of demanding obedience, systems must cultivate the beauty of freedom. They must encourage critical friction, allow individuals the space to make massive errors, and foster the capacity to stand alone.
So taking all these complex threads and weaving them together gives us a profound lens to view our own lives.
It really does.
We operate on a horizontal plane, treating life as an infinite spreadsheet of desires, constantly chasing a horizon that always recedes. And we do this because the alternative, dropping the search, Stepping into the vertical moment and letting the ego completely dissolve terrifies us.
And because we are so terrified of that absolute dissolution, we eagerly accept substitutes. We train our minds to produce internal bells and mental screensavers.
We settle for the deep, restorative sleep of hypnosis, convincing ourselves it is spiritual progress, rather than doing the excruciating work of maintaining total consciousness in the face of absolute silence.
And the reason we lack the stamina for that true meditation, the reason we are so fragile, is that we have been raised as bonsai trees. We've allowed families, workplaces, and cultures to continuously clip our roots in exchange for the comfort of fitting in.
Trading our authentic individuality for a hollow, meaningless yes.
The text inherently forces a brutal self-audit on the reader. It asks you to examine the structural integrity of your own choices. Look closely at your career path, the dynamics of your relationships, the beliefs you defend. Are those structures built on a foundation of conscious, vertical choices? Or are they simply the accumulated result of decades of conditioned servility?
Are you truly living as an individual, or are you just beautifully performing the role of the obedient tree in a shallow pot?
That is the uncomfortable, brilliant core of this text. It pulls back the curtain on how much effort we expend just to avoid being free.
So as you move through your day, consider the mechanics of your own horizontal life. If your ego, your curated identity, and your endless list of future goals are the only things keeping you tethered to a cycle of perpetual dissatisfaction, what would happen if you stopped walking toward the horizon? What would your life actually look like tomorrow if you woke up, dropped the exhausting need to be a somebody, and decided to just dancingly disappear into the reality of the present moment?